A flight and a reckoning. Harry wiped the last bit of grease off his hands with a clean rag, his muscles aching from hours of chopping vegetables and stirring pots at the downtown homeless shelter. He glanced around the now empty kitchen, the faint smell of tomato soup still lingering in the air. The kitchen was spotless, every counter gleaming and every pot stacked neatly. "Thank you again, Harry," said Maria, the shelter's coordinator, her face bright despite the long day. She adjusted her glasses as she gave him a warm smile. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Harry smiled back, a subtle warmth in his expression. "You know I wouldn't miss it. Wednesdays here keep me grounded," he replied, grabbing his worn canvas backpack from the hook near the exit. He looked at his watch and realized he had just enough time to catch his flight. As he stepped into the cool evening air, Harry felt the familiar pull of humility and gratitude. He could have been anywhere in the world, on a private island or dining at a five-star restaurant, but he chose this. Despite the billions in his account, Harry lived in a modest three-bedroom house, drove a reliable but old Toyota Camry, and wore his favorite faded band t-shirts. It wasn't just a choice, it was a principle instilled by his late mother. "Your worth is measured by what you give, not what you own," her voice echoed in his memory. She'd raised him to value people, not possessions, and Harry had taken that lesson to heart. The airport was bustling with activity as Harry parked his car and walked through the terminal. The long lines and chatter of travelers felt like background noise to him. He booked a first-class seat as usual, not because he wanted luxury, but because it was practical for his business trips. In his simple jeans and sneakers, no one gave him a second glance, and that's how he liked it. At the security checkpoint, the TSA agent barely glanced at him, waving him through without so much as a polite, "Have a good day." The businessman ahead of him, dressed in an immaculate suit, received a warm smile and friendly small talk. Harry noticed, but didn't react. It wasn't the first time he'd been overlooked, and it likely wouldn't be the last. As he approached the airline counter to check in, the young attendant glanced up briefly before returning to her screen. Her tone was brisk and dismissive. "Destination: Chicago," Harry replied, sliding his ID across the counter. Without looking up, she typed his information into the system and printed his boarding pass. "Next," she called, already looking past him. Harry took his ticket without a word, his calm demeanor intact. Years ago, he might have felt anger or indignation, but now he just felt tired. It wasn't worth the energy to react to every slight. The moment Harry stepped into the first-class cabin, Linda, the lead flight attendant, spotted him. Her gaze lingered a little too long, her brows knitting together as she noted his casual attire. He was clearly out of place, or so she thought. Linda prided herself on maintaining high standards in her cabin, and Harry didn't fit her mental image of a first-class passenger. "Excuse me, sir," Linda said, stepping directly in front of Harry. Her tone was firm, with just a hint of condescension. "This is the first-class section." Harry's calm smile didn't waver. "Yes, I know. My seat is 2A. Her eyes narrowed. "I'll need to see your boarding pass," she said, holding out her hand. Harry handed her the ticket, maintaining his composure as Linda scrutinized it as if it were counterfeit. She flipped it over, held it up to the light, and frowned. "This ticket costs thousands of dollars," she said pointedly. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers, some looking up from their phones to watch the interaction. Harry noticed but remained calm. "I purchased it through the airline's website," he replied simply. Linda's skepticism only deepened. "I've worked this route for years, and I'd never seen you before," she said, her tone turning accusatory. "I'm going to need to verify this with security." Harry opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Linda had already summoned airport security. Within moments, 2 uniformed officers appeared, their presence making the tension in the cabin even more palpable. "This passenger's story doesn't add up," Linda said, handing them Harry's ticket. "I don't feel comfortable with him remaining on board." One of the officers examined the ticket and frowned. "It's valid," he said quietly. "I don't care what it appears to be," Linda snapped. "I have the authority to remove any passenger I deem suspicious." Harry stood quietly as the officers turned to him. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to step off the plane." The humiliation was almost tangible as Harry retrieved his backpack from the overhead compartment. He could feel the weight of the passenger's stares as he walked down the aisle, his head held high despite the indignity. Back in the terminal, Harry found a quiet corner to sit and collect his thoughts. He dialed a number on his phone, his voice calm but firm. "James," he said, addressing his assistant, "I need the legal team on this immediately. Something happened on my flight, and we need to address it." Through the large windows, Harry watched as his intended plane taxied away from the gate. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had worked tirelessly to build his life from nothing, now facing prejudice that he'd hoped society had outgrown. But this wasn't just about him. This was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that no one else had to endure what he just experienced. Harry wasn't just a billionaire. He was an advocate for fairness and equality, and he wasn't about to let this incident slide. The fallout begins. The airport was a whirl of activity, oblivious to the storm brewing behind closed doors. Harry sat quietly in a VIP lounge, his presence inconspicuous amidst the hustle. He leaned back in the chair, his phone pressed to his ear. Across from him, his assistant, James, was frantically typing on a laptop, occasionally stealing concerned glances at his boss. "I've already contacted the legal team," James said, not looking up from his screen. "They're drafting a formal complaint to the airline." "But Harry, are you sure you want to do this quietly? The press would have a field day if they knew who you were and what happened." Harry sighed, closing his eyes for a moment. "It's not about embarrassing anyone," he said softly. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. Let's give them a chance to do the right thing first." James hesitated but nodded. He'd worked for Harry long enough to know that his boss valued dignity and principle above spectacle. Back on the plane, Linda returned to her duties, a satisfied smirk playing on her lips. She glanced at the empty seat in 2A and felt a sense of accomplishment. As far as she was concerned, she had upheld the integrity of the first-class cabin. After all, standards had to be maintained. Her junior attendant, Claire, approached hesitantly. "Linda, I'm not sure about what just happened." His ticket seemed valid, and he didn't seem like a Claire, Linda interrupted sharply, straightening her perfectly ironed uniform. "You're new, so let me explain how these things work. Maintaining the class and exclusivity of first class means making judgment calls. People who belong here act like they belong." Claire looked unconvinced, but nodded, falling silent. Linda returned to preparing for the in-flight service, her confidence unshaken. Meanwhile, at Continental Airways corporate headquarters, a crisis was unfolding. Harry's team had sent a formal email to the CEO, detailing the incident and attaching a detailed account of the events. The response was immediate. Lisa Tremont, the vice president of customer relations, was called into an emergency meeting. Sitting around the table were key executives, including the CEO, Marcus Lawson, a tall, imposing man with sharp features. "This is a disaster waiting to happen," Marcus said, tossing the printed email onto the table. "Do you have any idea who Harry Rodriguez is? He owns a significant stake in this airline. He's on our board of directors, for crying out loud." Lisa's face paled. I wasn't aware. I'll handle it immediately." "You better," Marcus snapped. "If this goes public, we'll be facing not just a PR nightmare, but potential lawsuits and shareholder backlash." "Fix it." 20 minutes later, Linda was summoned to the cockpit mid-flight. She walked in, expecting routine instructions from the captain, but the tension in the small space made her pause. "Linda," Captain Stevens said, his face unusually serious, "I just got a call from corporate. The passenger you removed. That was Harry Rodriguez." Linda frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "I don't understand. Who is he?" The captain's lips tightened. He's one of the airline's largest investors. He owns 30% of this company, and he's also a member of the board of directors. The blood drained from Linda's face as the weight of the situation hit her. I didn't know," she stammered. "You didn't bother to find out," the captain retorted, his tone sharp. "Corporate is furious. Linda, you're to report directly to the main office as soon as we land. I suggest you start thinking about how to explain yourself." Linda stumbled out of the cockpit, her mind racing. The realization of what she had done crashed over her like a tidal wave. The calm, polite man she dismissed and humiliated wasn't just any passenger. He was one of the most powerful figures in the airline industry. When the plane landed, Linda's anxiety hit a fever pitch. She avoided eye contact with passengers as they disembarked, each interaction feeling like a potential confrontation. Claire gave her a worried look, but said nothing as Linda gathered her things and made her way to the corporate office. The atmosphere in the room was icy as Linda entered. Lisa Tremont was seated at the head of the table, her expression grim. A thick folder lay open in front of her, its contents spread across the table. Linda noticed Harry's name at the top of one of the documents and felt a pang of dread. "Ms. Simpson," Lisa began, her tone cold, "do you have any idea what kind of liability you've created for this airline?" Linda swallowed hard, her palms sweating. I was just following protocol," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought he was suspicious, and I wanted to ensure the safety and comfort of the other passengers." Lisa's eyes narrowed. Suspicious? Based on what? His valid ticket? His calm demeanor? Or was it something else entirely? Linda flinched but didn't respond. Lisa continued, her voice cutting like a blade. "We've received a formal complaint from Mr. Rodriguez. He didn't go to the press, which is the only reason we're having this conversation in private. But make no mistake, this is a serious issue. And it's not the first time your behavior has been called into question." She gestured to the folder. 17 complaints in the past year alone, Linda. All from passengers who described similar experiences, being treated with suspicion or hostility based on their appearance. This isn't just an isolated incident. It's a pattern. Linda felt the walls closing in on her. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Lisa held up a hand. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. The legal team is involved now, and your actions could have consequences far beyond your employment." That night, Linda sat alone in her modest living room, staring blankly at the termination letter she'd been handed after the meeting. Her world was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself. For years, she had prided herself on her professionalism and attention to detail, but now those same qualities felt like a cruel joke. The weight of her mistakes pressed down on her like an anchor. She thought of Harry, his calm dignity as he was escorted off the plane. She thought of the other passengers she'd treated unfairly over the years, their faces blurring together in her memory. For the first time, Linda saw herself clearly, not as the efficient, authoritative professional she'd always imagined, but as someone who had allowed prejudice and arrogance to cloud her judgment. And now, she was paying the price. But as she stared at the letter, one thought stood out in her mind. Could she find a way to make things right? Across town, Harry sat in his home office, reviewing documents his legal team had prepared. He had a choice to make. He could pursue legal action and expose the airline's failure, or he could use this moment to push for meaningful change. His decision would not only shape the airline's future, but also set an example for an industry in desperate need of reform. Harry leaned back in his chair, his mind already formulating a plan. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, and he intended to see it through. Ripples of consequence. Harry leaned back in his leather chair, the warm glow of his home office contrasting with the storm brewing in his thoughts. A stack of documents lay on his desk, reports, proposals, and preliminary legal drafts prepared by his team. His phone buzzed with notifications from colleagues and board members, but he ignored them for the moment. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about dismantling the assumptions that led to his removal from the flight and ensuring no one else endured the same indignity. He wasn't interested in a public spectacle. He wanted systemic change. Meanwhile, at Continental Airways corporate headquarters, the fallout was already unfolding. Linda's actions had triggered a cascade of events that extended far beyond her suspension. In a sterile boardroom lit by harsh fluorescent lights, the airline's legal and PR teams were locked in a tense discussion. Marcus Lawson, the CEO, stood at the head of the table, his expression thunderous. "Do you all understand what's at stake here? This isn't just about one disgruntled passenger. This is Harry Rodriguez. If he wanted to, he could sink this airline tomorrow." Lisa Tremont, the vice president of customer relations, nodded, her jaw tight. "We've been reviewing complaints about Linda Simpson," she said, flipping through a thick folder. "The pattern is clear. Multiple passengers have described discriminatory treatment, all pointing back to her." Marcus pinched the bridge of his nose. How did this go unnoticed for so long? Lisa hesitated. Some complaints were brushed off as misunderstandings. Others were logged but never followed up on. It's a systemic failure, not just an individual one. Back in her modest two-story home, Linda sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her termination letter. Her husband, Paul, sat across from her, his face etched with concern and frustration. "How did this happen, Linda?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "You've been with that airline for over 20 years. This isn't like you." Linda opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. How could she explain the choices she'd made, the biases she'd harbored, even if subconsciously? She'd convinced herself she was protecting the standards of first class, but in truth, she had been wielding her authority unfairly. "It was a mistake," she whispered finally. "A terrible mistake." Paul leaned forward, his tone softening. "You need to do more than admit it to me. What are you going to do about it?" Linda didn't respond, but the question lingered long after Paul left the room. What could she do to make amends for something this monumental? While Linda wrestled with her guilt, Harry moved forward with a clear plan. He convened a meeting with his legal team, PR advisors, and a select group of trusted associates in his sprawling but modest home. "I want to focus on systemic change," Harry began, his tone calm but resolute. "This isn't just about one person's actions. It's about the culture that allows those actions to go unchecked." Margaret Chen, his lead attorney, nodded. "We've drafted a proposal for a comprehensive diversity and sensitivity training program," she said, sliding a document across the table. "It's ambitious, but with your backing, I think we can make it happen." Harry skimmed the proposal, his brow furrowing in thought. "It's a good start," he said, "but we need to go further. This can't be a one-off initiative. It needs to be ongoing, measurable, and enforced at every level of the organization." "What about the public?" James asked, his voice cautious. "This will eventually get out. Do we let them control the narrative, or do we take charge?" Harry tapped his fingers on the table, considering the question. "We'll release a statement," he decided, "but it won't be about me. It'll be about the changes the airline is committing to. This isn't about naming and shaming. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." At Continental Airways, the pressure was mounting. The legal team had finalized their recommendations, and the board was preparing to vote on the proposed diversity training initiative. The airline's PR department was working overtime to craft a statement that balanced accountability with reassurance. But not everyone was on board. "This is going to cost millions," grumbled Richard Palmer, a senior executive, during a board meeting. "Why should we overhaul our entire system for one incident?" Lisa Tremont's patience finally snapped. "Because this isn't one incident," she said, her voice steely. "It's a pattern of behavior that we've ignored for far too long. And if we don't act now, the cost to our reputation will be far greater than the cost of this program." Marcus Lawson, the CEO, nodded. "Lisa's right. This isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about our credibility as a company. If we don't take this seriously, we risk losing more than just Harry's investment. We risk losing the trust of our customers." The board voted unanimously to implement the program. As news of the airline's initiative began to spread, Linda watched from the sidelines, her emotions a tangled mess of regret and self-recrimination. She had spent years believing she was upholding a standard of excellence, only to realize she had been contributing to a culture of exclusion. One evening, she sat down at her laptop and composed an email. It was addressed to Harry Rodriguez. She didn't expect a response, but she needed to say the words out loud, even if only to herself. Dear Mr. Rodriguez, I am writing to apologize for my actions on that flight and for the pain I caused you. There is no excuse for my behavior, and I take full responsibility for the assumptions I made about you. I have spent the past weeks reflecting on my actions and the patterns of behavior that led to them. I see now that I allowed my biases to guide my decisions, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I understand that an apology cannot undo the harm I've caused, but I hope to learn from this experience and become a better person. If there is any way I can make amends, please let me know. Sincerely, Linda Simpson. Linda stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. She didn't know if Harry would read it, let alone respond, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that she could learn, grow, and perhaps contribute to the change he was fighting for. Harry received the email late at night. He read it twice, then set it aside. He wasn't interested in personal apologies. His focus was on the future, on ensuring the culture that had allowed such actions to persist was dismantled piece by piece. But as he sat in the quiet of his office, he felt a small measure of satisfaction. The ripples of change were already spreading, and for the first time in a long time, he felt optimistic about what lay ahead. The first steps toward change. The world outside Continental Airways continued its hum of daily life, but within the airline's headquarters, there was no mistaking the tension in the air. Executives shuffled between conference rooms with furrowed brows. Department heads whispered in urgent tones, and a team of lawyers worked tirelessly to draft the company's official statement regarding the incident with Harry Rodriguez. At the center of it all was Lisa Tremont. She stood at the head of a long conference table, her tablet loaded with slides detailing the comprehensive diversity initiative the company was preparing to unveil. Her voice was steady, but there was a sharpness to her tone that left no room for doubt about the gravity of the situation. This isn't just about making a statement, Lisa said, addressing the senior leadership team. It's about fundamentally changing how we operate as a company. This training isn't optional. It's mandatory for every employee, from baggage handlers to executives. We're also establishing a diversity and inclusion board to oversee these efforts and ensure accountability. Across the table, Richard Palmer raised a hand. And how are we funding this? Let's not forget, we're already dealing with rising costs in other areas. Lisa shot him a glare. We're funding it because we have to, Richard. The cost of doing nothing will be far greater, not just financially, but in terms of our reputation and customer trust. Marcus Lawson, the CEO, leaned forward. Lisa's right. We've already received inquiries from major media outlets. If we don't act decisively, we'll be painted as an organization that tolerates discrimination. That's a risk we can't afford. Meanwhile, Harry Rodriguez watched the developments unfold from a distance. He'd made his position clear to the airline's board and had been pleased to see them move quickly on his recommendations. But his work wasn't done yet. Sitting in his modest home office, Harry prepared for a meeting with other stakeholders in the airline industry. He had used his influence to arrange a private summit with executives from several major carriers. His goal was simple: to encourage them to adopt similar diversity initiatives within their own organizations. As the virtual meeting began, Harry addressed the group with his characteristic calm but firm demeanor. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident," he began. "It's part of a larger issue in our industry, an issue we can't ignore any longer. We have a responsibility, not just as business leaders, but as human beings, to ensure that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect." The executives listened intently, their expressions ranging from thoughtful to guarded. Harry knew this wouldn't be an easy sell. Change, especially on a systemic level, was never easy. But he also knew the power of persistence. While Harry worked behind the scenes, Linda Simpson faced a far more personal reckoning. Her days at the airline were over, and her once orderly life had descended into chaos. Without her steady income, the family's financial situation had quickly become precarious. The mortgage was overdue, medical bills for her daughter Emily's ongoing illness were piling up, and the tension in her household was palpable. Linda had taken a job as a waitress at a local diner, a far cry from her former position as a senior flight attendant. The work was grueling, the hours long, and the pay barely enough to cover the basics. But what weighed on Linda most wasn't the physical toll, it was the humiliation. Every interaction with customers reminded her of her own behavior during her years at the airline. When patrons snapped at her for slow service or dismissed her with a wave of the hand, she felt the sting of her own past actions mirrored back at her. One evening, after a particularly difficult shift, Linda sat in the back alley of the diner, her grease-stained apron crumpled in her lap. Tears streamed down her face as she thought about everything she had lost, not just her career, but her sense of self-worth. The memory of Harry's calm, dignified expression as he was escorted off the plane haunted her. She had judged him unfairly, treated him as less than human, and now she was experiencing firsthand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of such treatment. It was during one of these moments of introspection that Linda received a surprising message. A man named Jason, a former colleague at the airline, had reached out after hearing about her termination. "Linda, I know you've been going through a rough time," Jason's message read. "I've started volunteering with a local organization that focuses on diversity and inclusion training. They're looking for people who've experienced both sides of these issues. People who've made mistakes, but are willing to share their stories and help others learn. If you're interested, let me know." Linda stared at the message for a long time. The idea of speaking publicly about her mistakes was terrifying, but a small part of her wondered if this could be her chance to start making amends. At the same time, Continental Airways was preparing for the rollout of its new training program. The first session was scheduled to take place at their largest hub, and Harry had been invited to attend as an observer. When the day arrived, Harry entered the training room quietly, taking a seat at the back. The room was filled with employees from all levels of the organization, from flight attendants to senior managers. A facilitator stood at the front, leading a discussion about unconscious bias and the importance of creating an inclusive environment. Harry listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. He was encouraged by the open and honest dialogue taking place, but he also knew this was only the beginning. Changing a company's culture would take time, effort, and constant vigilance. A few days later, Linda decided to take Jason up on his offer. She attended her first meeting with the diversity organization, unsure of what to expect. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, each with their own stories of struggle, growth, and redemption. When it was her turn to speak, Linda hesitated, her voice trembling as she began. "I was a flight attendant for over 20 years, she said. "And during that time, I made a lot of mistakes. I judged people unfairly, acted out of bias, and hurt others because of my actions. I've lost everything because of those choices. But I want to learn. I want to do better." As Linda shared her story, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time, she wasn't just dwelling on her mistakes. She was taking the first steps toward making things right. Back at his home, Harry received an email from Linda. It wasn't her first message, but this one was different. It wasn't just an apology. It was an update on the steps she was taking to grow and change. Harry read the email carefully, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he forwarded the email to Lisa Tremont with a simple note: "Keep this in mind as we continue to build our program. People can change if we give them the tools and opportunity to do so." As he closed his laptop, Harry felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The journey toward justice and reconciliation was far from over, but progress was being made. one step at a time, turning pain into purpose. Linda had always been a proud woman. Her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude were hallmarks of her personality, traits that had propelled her through 2 decades of service in the airline industry. But pride had become her downfall, blinding her to the biases that had long influenced her actions. Now, as she sat in a crowded community center, surrounded by a diverse group of people, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: humility. It had been weeks since Jason invited her to the diversity and inclusion group, and each session peeled back another layer of her defenses. Tonight's topic was the role of implicit bias in everyday life. The facilitator, a middle-aged woman named Deborah, had a commanding yet compassionate presence. "Bias is like a lens through which we see the world," Deborah explained, pacing at the front of the room. "It's shaped by our upbringing, our environment, and our experiences. But here's the thing. Just because we have a lens doesn't mean we can't change it." Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She thought about her years as a flight attendant, where she had wielded her authority with a confidence that now seemed hollow. How many passengers had she judged based on their clothes, their accents, or their demeanor? How many had she dismissed simply because they didn't fit her narrow idea of who belonged? When it was her turn to speak, Linda hesitated. She took a deep breath and stood, her voice shaking slightly as she addressed the group. "My name is Linda," she began. "I used to be a flight attendant, and I made a lot of mistakes. I treated people unfairly because of my own biases. I thought I was maintaining standards, but really, I was just making excuses for my behavior." The room was silent as Linda continued, her words tumbling out in a mix of shame and determination. "I lost my job because of it, and I deserve to. But I don't want that to be the end of my story. I want to do better. I want to be better." When she sat down, the room erupted into applause, not out of pity, but respect. Linda felt tears prick her eyes, a mix of relief and something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. While Linda was finding her way back to herself, Harry Rodriguez was busy orchestrating systemic change on a scale few could imagine. The airline's diversity initiative was in full swing, and Harry had taken a hands-on approach, attending training sessions, meeting with employees, and offering his insights to the newly established Diversity and Inclusion Board. One morning, he arrived at Continental Airways' main training facility, where a workshop on unconscious bias was underway. Employees from various departments sat in groups, engaged in a spirited discussion led by a skilled facilitator. Harry observed quietly from the back of the room, taking notes as he listened to the conversations. One group was discussing an exercise where participants shared moments when they'd felt judged or excluded. "I never realized how much little things matter," said a young woman wearing a baggage handler's uniform. "Like when passengers assume I don't speak English just because of my accent. It's small, but it adds up." Another employee, a senior manager in a crisp suit, nodded thoughtfully. "I think we all have blind spots. This training is making me question a lot of things I took for granted." Harry felt a quiet satisfaction as he watched the group engage in open and honest dialogue. This was what he'd envisioned when he first proposed the initiative: a space where people could confront their biases and grow together. As the weeks passed, the effects of Harry's efforts began to ripple outward. Other airlines took notice, with several implementing their own diversity programs. Industry leaders reached out to Harry for advice, and he found himself at the center of a movement that was reshaping the culture of air travel. Despite the progress, Harry remained humble. He refused to let the spotlight linger on him, redirecting attention to the broader goals of inclusion and equality. When a journalist asked him why he hadn't gone public with his experience, Harry simply replied, "This was never about me. It's about ensuring that everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve." Back in her small home, Linda was beginning to rebuild her life. The job at the diner was still grueling, but she found a surprising sense of purpose in her work with the diversity group. She had started volunteering at their events, sharing her story with others who were struggling to confront their own biases. One day, she received an unexpected email. It was from Lisa Tremont, the Vice President of Customer Relations at Continental Airways. The subject line read, "An opportunity to contribute." Linda's hands shook as she opened the message. "Dear Ms. Simpson, I hope this message finds you well. I am writing to you on behalf of Continental Airways Diversity and Inclusion Board. We've been following your journey and are impressed by your commitment to growth and self-reflection. As part of our ongoing efforts to create a more inclusive workplace, we are launching a new program designed to engage former employees who can offer unique insights into the challenges and opportunities of addressing bias. Your experience, while difficult, has given you a perspective that could be invaluable to our efforts. We would like to invite you to join us as a consultant for this initiative. The position is part-time and temporary, but it offers a chance to contribute meaningfully to the work we're doing. Please let us know if you're interested. Best regards, Lisa Tremont." Linda read the email 3 times, disbelief mingling with a flicker of hope. She had spent weeks grappling with guilt, unsure if she would ever find redemption. Now, here was a chance, not to undo the past, but to help shape a better future. The first meeting was nerve-wracking. Linda walked into the conference room at Continental Airways, her heart pounding. She wasn't wearing her flight attendant uniform anymore, but the memories of her time at the airline were still fresh. Lisa greeted her warmly, and Linda took a seat at the table, surrounded by other consultants, board members, and facilitators. As the discussion began, Linda found her voice. She shared her experiences openly, offering insights into how small actions and attitudes could snowball into systemic problems. By the end of the meeting, Linda felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. She wasn't just trying to make amends. She was helping to build something bigger than herself. Harry and Linda's paths crossed for the first time at a company event celebrating the launch of the new diversity program. Harry had been invited as a guest speaker, and Linda was there as a consultant. When they met, Linda extended her hand hesitantly. "Mr. Rodriguez," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know if you remember me, but Harry interrupted her with a gentle smile. "I remember," he said. "And I see the work you've been doing. It takes courage to confront your mistakes and grow from them." Linda felt tears welling up, but managed a small smile. "Thank you for everything." Harry nodded. "We're all part of the same journey. The important thing is that we keep moving forward." As they stood there, the event bustling around them, it was clear that the story wasn't just about consequences. It was about transformation for individuals and for an industry. And in that moment, both Harry and Linda knew they were making a difference. Linda and Harry exchanged a few more words before the event's program began. Harry was called to the stage to deliver a keynote address, and Linda found a seat near the back, her emotions a mix of pride and trepidation. She watched as Harry, calm and composed, addressed the room with the kind of authenticity that had come to define him. "Good evening," Harry began, his voice steady but warm. "I want to start by acknowledging everyone here who has committed themselves to this journey. Change isn't easy. It's uncomfortable. It's messy, and it requires us to confront parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. But it's also necessary." The room was silent, every attendee hanging on his words. "What happened to me on that flight could have been an opportunity for outrage," he continued. "And trust me, there were moments when I felt that anger. But I realized something important. Outrage without action leads nowhere. What we need is transformation of ourselves, of our organizations, and of our culture." Linda felt a lump in her throat as Harry spoke. His words weren't just about what had happened to him. They were about the system that had allowed it to happen and the collective responsibility to make things right. Harry went on to outline the progress that had been made since the incident. The mandatory training sessions, the creation of the Diversity and Inclusion Board, and the implementation of new policies designed to ensure accountability at every level of the airline. "This isn't the end of the journey," he said, his tone resolute. It's the beginning, and it's a journey we all have to take together." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Harry stepped down from the stage, shaking hands and exchanging words with attendees as he made his way back to his seat. Linda caught his eye and gave him a small, appreciative nod. He returned the gesture. After the event, Linda found herself in a quiet corner of the room, reflecting on everything that had brought her to this point. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to see Lisa Tremont. "You've come a long way, Linda," Lisa said, her voice kind but firm. "I've been watching how you've approached this work, and I'm impressed. But I have to ask, what's next for you?" Linda hesitated. The question had been swirling in her mind for weeks. The consulting role had given her a renewed sense of purpose, but she knew it was temporary. What she wanted now was a chance to use her experiences to create lasting change. "I want to do more," Linda said finally. "I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I know I want to help others avoid the mistakes I made. I want to make sure people feel seen and valued." Lisa smiled. "That's a good start. And if you're interested, we could use someone with your perspective on the Diversity and Inclusion Board. It's a bigger commitment, but I think you're ready for it." Linda's heart raced. The idea of joining the board felt both daunting and exhilarating. She nodded. "I'd be honored." In the weeks that followed, Linda's role on the board became official. She threw herself into the work, contributing ideas for training programs, helping to develop new policies, and sharing her story with employees across the organization. Her honesty and vulnerability resonated with others, turning her into an unlikely but effective advocate for change. At the same time, Harry continued to expand his efforts beyond Continental Airways. He partnered with advocacy groups, spoke at industry conferences, and collaborated with other leaders to implement similar initiatives in their companies. The movement he had sparked was gaining momentum, and he remained at the center of it, guiding it with humility and determination. One afternoon, Harry received a message from Linda. It was short but heartfelt. "Dear Harry, I just wanted to thank you again for your grace, your vision, and your willingness to turn a personal slight into an opportunity for change. Your example has inspired me in ways I can't fully express. I'm not the same person I was when we first crossed paths, and I owe a large part of that to you. I hope to continue the work you've started and to make you proud. With gratitude, Linda." Harry read the email and smiled. He didn't reply right away. He rarely did, but he made a mental note to reach out to Linda soon. For now, he was content knowing that the ripple effect of his actions was continuing to grow. Months later, at a large industry summit, Harry and Linda shared the stage for the first time. The room was packed with executives, employees, and activists from across the airline industry, all eager to hear about the progress that had been made and the challenges that still lay ahead. Linda spoke first, recounting her journey with raw honesty. She didn't shy away from the mistakes she'd made or the consequences she'd faced, but she also highlighted the lessons she'd learned and the work she was doing to create a more inclusive industry. When it was Harry's turn, he spoke about the importance of systemic change, emphasizing that true progress required both individual accountability and organizational commitment. As they stood together at the end of the event, the applause ringing in their ears, Linda turned to Harry and said, "I never imagined we'd end up here." Harry smiled. "Neither did I, but sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most rewarding destinations." For both of them, the journey wasn't over, but they had found a shared purpose, a mission to create a world where everyone, regardless of appearance or background, could be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. And that, they knew, was a journey worth continuing. A legacy of change. The grand ballroom of the Global Aviation Conference buzzed with anticipation. Industry leaders, policymakers, and activists filled the room, eager to hear the keynote speakers who had become symbols of transformation in the airline industry. At the center of the buzz were Harry Rodriguez and Linda Simpson, two individuals whose unlikely connection had sparked a wave of change that was still rippling through the aviation world. Linda adjusted the microphone on the podium, taking a steadying breath as she looked out at the audience. She had spoken at events before, but this was different. This was global, an opportunity to show how one person's failure could become a catalyst for systemic improvement. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady but charged with emotion. "If you told me a year ago that I'd be standing here today, I wouldn't have believed you. A year ago, I was a senior flight attendant, a title I carried with pride, but also one that I didn't realize I was misusing." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. Linda shared her story, beginning with the fateful day she'd removed Harry from a flight. She didn't sugarcoat her actions or make excuses. Instead, she described the deep introspection that followed, the shame she'd felt, and the hard work she'd undertaken to confront her biases. "But this isn't just about me," she continued. "It's about a system that allowed those biases to go unchecked. It's about an industry that for too long has prioritized efficiency over empathy, and it's about the incredible work we've done together to change that." Linda stepped back from the podium, and the audience erupted into applause. She caught Harry's eye as he approached the stage, his calm confidence a reassuring presence. Harry adjusted his tie as he stepped up to the microphone, his demeanor as unassuming as ever. "Thank you, Linda, for your courage and honesty," he began. "Your journey is a testament to the power of accountability and growth, and it's an honor to share this stage with you." He paused, letting his words settle over the audience. "When I think back to the day I was removed from that flight, I don't dwell on the anger or humiliation I felt. Instead, I think about the opportunity it presented, not just for me, but for all of us. That day wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a mirror reflecting the work we still needed to do." Harry spoke about the changes that had been implemented at Continental Airways. Mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, the creation of a diversity and inclusion board, and new policies designed to ensure transparency and accountability. He also highlighted the broader impact of these initiatives, with other airlines and industries following suit. "This is only the beginning," he said. "True change requires constant vigilance. It requires us to question our assumptions, to listen to voices we've ignored, and to commit to creating environments where everyone feels valued and respected." When he finished, the applause was deafening. Harry and Linda shook hands at the center of the stage, a symbol of the progress they had made together. After the event, Harry and Linda found themselves in a quiet corner of the ballroom, sipping glasses of water and reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. "You've come a long way," Harry said, his tone warm but measured. "You should be proud." Linda smiled, a mix of gratitude and humility. "I couldn't have done it without you. You didn't have to respond to my email, but you did. And that changed everything for me." Harry shook his head. "You changed everything for yourself. All I did was open the door." Linda looked at him, her expression serious. "Why did you? Why not just write me off after what I did?" Harry took a moment before answering. "Because I believe people can change, and because holding on to anger would have only held me back. This wasn't about me. It was about making sure the next person doesn't have to go through what I did." Over the next year, the impact of Harry and Linda's efforts continued to grow. Linda became a sought-after speaker and consultant, her story inspiring others to confront their own biases and embrace change. She also worked closely with the Diversity and Inclusion Board at Continental Airways, helping to develop new programs and initiatives that prioritized empathy and understanding. Harry expanded his work beyond the airline industry, partnering with organizations across various sectors to promote inclusion and equity. His approach, focused on collaboration rather than blame, earned him widespread respect and admiration. One afternoon, Harry received a letter from a young woman named Jasmine, who had recently completed Continental Airways' new training program. Jasmine was a first-generation college graduate who had always dreamed of becoming a flight attendant, but had doubted whether she'd be accepted in an industry that often seemed unwelcoming to people like her. "Mr. Rodriguez," the letter began, "I wanted to thank you for what you've done. The training program you helped create didn't just prepare me for my job. It made me feel like I belonged. For the first time, I feel seen, valued, and capable of achieving my dreams." Harry read the letter twice, a quiet smile spreading across his face. This was why he had chosen to act, not for recognition, but for the lives that could be changed as a result. Back in her modest home, Linda sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers and notes for an upcoming workshop she was leading. Her daughter Emily walked in, holding a drawing she'd made for school. It was a picture of their family standing in front of a plane, with the words, "My mom helps people fly," scrawled at the bottom. Linda felt tears sting her eyes as she looked at the drawing. For so long, she had seen her career as a source of pride and status, but now she understood its deeper meaning. She wasn't just helping people reach their destinations, she was helping them feel like they belonged, wherever they were. In the years that followed, Harry and Linda's paths crossed often, their shared mission binding them in ways neither had anticipated. They became unlikely allies in the fight for equity and inclusion, their partnership a testament to the power of accountability, growth, and grace. As they stood together at yet another industry event, Linda turned to Harry and said, "Do you think we'll ever be finished?" Harry smiled. "Change is never finished, but every step we take makes the path a little easier for the ones who come after us." And with that, they returned to the stage, ready to take the next step on a journey that had already transformed so many lives, and would continue to do so for years to come. A journey fulfilled. As the evening wore on, Harry and Linda found themselves at a quiet table on the balcony of the conference venue. The city skyline twinkled in the distance, and the hum of voices from the ballroom faded into the background. They were far from the spotlight now, their conversation intimate and reflective. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with a mix of gratitude and regret. "That day on the plane feels like a lifetime ago." Harry nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I do, but not with anger anymore. I think about how far we've come, not just us, but everyone who's been part of this journey." Linda smiled, her expression soft. "It's strange. Losing my job felt like the end of everything, but it turned out to be the beginning of something so much bigger." Harry studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Growth always starts with discomfort. You could have let that moment define you in the worst way, but you chose to use it to redefine yourself. That's rare." Linda looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "You gave me a chance to do that. I hope I've made good on it." "You have," Harry said simply. "And it's not just about what you've done. It's about what you're inspiring others to do. That's the real legacy." The following week, Linda sat in a meeting with Continental Airways Diversity and Inclusion Board, her role now firmly established as a vital part of the team. They were reviewing a new initiative aimed at recruiting and mentoring employees from underrepresented backgrounds. Linda had spearheaded the program, drawing on her own experiences to shape its structure. "It's not just about hiring more diverse staff," Linda explained to the group. "It's about creating an environment where they feel supported and empowered to succeed. That means ongoing mentorship, open channels for feedback, and a culture that values their contributions." The board members nodded in agreement, their enthusiasm palpable. Linda felt a surge of pride, not the hollow pride she used to feel when enforcing her authority, but a deeper, more fulfilling pride rooted in purpose and service. Harry, meanwhile, was preparing for his next project. His work in the airline industry had set a precedent, but he knew there were other sectors in need of transformation. Education, healthcare, tech, every industry had its blind spots, and Harry was determined to shine a light on them. One evening, as he reviewed proposals from advocacy groups and consulting firms, he came across a letter from a young man who had attended one of the diversity training sessions he'd helped establish. The man, a recent hire at Continental Airways, wrote about how the training had not only changed his perspective, but also strengthened his resolve to make a difference in his community. "You've shown me that leadership isn't about being in charge," the letter read. It's about using your voice and influence to uplift others. Thank you for teaching me that." Harry folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with others like it. These letters were his reminders of why he did this work, why it mattered. A year later, Continental Airways hosted a gala to celebrate the one-year anniversary of their diversity initiative. The event was a testament to the progress that had been made, with employees, board members, and community leaders coming together to reflect on their shared achievements. Linda was one of the featured speakers, her presence now emblematic of the company's commitment to growth and accountability. As she addressed the crowd, she spoke not just about her own journey, but about the collective journey they were all on. "We've shown that it's possible to turn mistakes into opportunities for growth," she said. "But our work isn't done. Change isn't a destination. It's a continuous process. And I'm honored to be part of a team that's committed to walking that path together." When she finished, the applause was deafening. Linda stepped down from the stage, her heart full as she joined Harry at their table. "You did good," Harry said, a rare hint of pride in his voice. Linda laughed, a sound that was equal parts relief and joy. "Coming from you, that means a lot." As the evening drew to a close, Harry and Linda stood side by side, watching the crowd mingle and celebrate. They didn't need to say much. Their shared understanding spoke volumes. For Harry, the journey was about ensuring the values his mother had instilled in him, compassion, humility, and justice, were carried forward. For Linda, it was about proving that redemption wasn't just possible, it could be transformative. As they parted ways that night, Linda looked back and said, "Thank you, Harry, for everything." Harry smiled, his expression serene. "Thank you, Linda, for choosing to be part of the solution." And with that, they walked into the next chapters of their lives, carrying with them the lessons of their shared journey and the knowledge that they had left the world just a little better than they'd found it.